Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome to another edition of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine video series. My name is John Lustria. For those of you who don't know, I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and very excited to be joined today by Dr. Lorien Foote. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, John. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, this should be a good one. We're going to be talking about her book, her recent book, Rites of Retaliation, Civilians, Soldiers, and Campaigns in the American Civil War. So all about laws of war, or sometimes lack thereof, and how that all shook out during the American Civil War. There's all kinds of interesting angles and stories and things to highlight in this realm. Definitely a lot of meat on the proverbial bone here. So I know I'm looking forward to this conversation quite a bit. Should be a good one. A lot of questions that I personally have sort of wondered about for a while. So it should be really good. As always, it's great to hear where you're watching from. So go ahead and sound off in the comments. Let us know where you're tuning in from. And of course, if you have any questions during the program, please drop them in the comments and we'll get to as many as we're able to. As always, if you like these videos, go ahead and hit that like button, hit the share button, maybe share it to perhaps a Civil War group that you might be in out there on social media, or just amongst your friends. Send it to someone specific. All that goes a long way towards helping support the museum, and it's easy and it's free. Anyone can do it. So if you help us out in that way, I'd be very grateful. If you want to take your support to the next level, consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, or donating to our latest fundraising campaign. We had the opportunity to purchase some letters written by Clara Barton. One of our 3 locations is the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum. And we had the chance to purchase some letters written by Clara Barton in May of 1865, when she lived in that space. And she kind of talks about the early days of the Missing Soldiers Office. They're really cool artifacts. And we're doing a fundraising campaign to help sort of offset the cost of those, as we sort of had to act fast with that. So that's another way you can support the museum if you want to take it to the next level. So I see we got Jan tuning in from Orlando. Hello, Jan. She's one of our faithful viewers. And thank you all for joining us. So with all that said, we'll go ahead and get into our conversation today. So Lorien, I wonder if maybe you could tell us about yourself and how you came to the field of Civil War history. Maybe help us, those out there who are unfamiliar, get to know you a little bit.
Sure. So I grew up in Norman, Oklahoma. I was the daughter of a professor in the industrial engineering department at OU. So I grew up in a college town and grew up, attending university events and just loved learning and all of that. And so I went to the University of Kansas, and then I went back to Oklahoma and got my PhD. And I had originally planned to work for the State Department, but some health issues intervened. So I didn't know what else to do. So I decided to get certified to teach high school. And along the way, I had to pick up some master's classes at the University of Oklahoma. And I took a history graduate seminar and I loved it. And I realized that that was what I wanted to do. And so my reading and just preparing in graduate school, I really came to love the 19th century. And so that's kind of what got me into that area.
It happens to the best of us.
Yes.
Splendid. We have some folks tuning in from New Orleans, Ray from across the pond in the UK. So we're broadcasting internationally here, which is always fun. So getting into the book, Rites of Retaliation, I wonder if maybe you could tell us where your inspiration was, how the book came about, and what sort of sources you consulted once you decided you were going to write about this, and if there are any maybe that surprised you.
Okay, sure. So let me answer the first question. about how did I come across this, and then I'll probably forget what your follow-up questions were. So after you'll have to remind me. But so every book I write comes out of something that just shocks me or strikes me in the previous research that I'm doing. And so what happened was I was writing a book about the mass escape of 3,000 Union prisoners of war from Confederate prison camps in Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina in 1864 and 1865. And as I was reading diaries and correspondence about this, I noticed that these prisoners were taken to Charleston and they were put into an area of the city that was under fire from United States guns. So they put US prisoners under the fire from guns of their own side. And in the correspondence, the Confederate officials were like, we're doing this as an act of retaliation. And I thought, that's interesting. I don't know much about that. And so I kind of needed to do some context for that. So I started researching what retaliation was, and I was shocked because it wasn't what historians had how they used the word. It was much deeper and richer than I thought. And so then that was the process that led me to the book.
Gotcha. So retaliation, I mean, sometimes with book titles, it can be either, intensely central to the theme of the book, or sometimes the book title is just something to sell that the publisher sort of foists upon the author. So retaliation is a very key word in your study here. So
yes.
Once you hit upon this and it's something you're like, wow, there's a lot here, I want to write about this, and you set about beginning your research, what sort of sources did you consult, and were there any maybe that surprised you as being as helpful as they were?
Yeah, so I consulted a variety of types of sources. So I used official records and correspondence of the Union and Confederate armies, official records and correspondence of the Union and Confederate War departments. I used letters and diaries from ordinary soldiers. I used newspapers. I used state records. So Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, the state level records. And I think what surprised me was that retaliation was everywhere. So that's part of what I mean about how rich and deep it turned out the topic was. Civilians, soldiers, high-level officers, newspaper journalists, everyone knew what it was. Everybody used the word. They talked about it all the time. So that was, I think, what surprised me the most.
Yeah, so well, then this seems like maybe a good time to talk about what exactly did you mention, how there was just this rich depth of meaning with the word retaliation. Maybe talk a bit more about that word specifically and why it was so key as you were kind of putting this all together.
Okay. So to do that, I have to talk about the other kind of key word that's in my title. So as you said, it's rites of retaliation. And then the next word is civilization, soldiers, and campaign. So you can't understand retaliation without understanding civilization. And those are kind of the two things the book is really about. So both Northerners and Southerners during the American Civil War, they cared deeply about being civilized people. They viewed the world by the categories of there's civilized people, there's barbaric people, there's savage people, and it's very important to be civilized. And they viewed civilization as kind of, it's the difference between humans and animals, the people who have been on this trajectory of human history, getting farther and farther away from animals, the people who are the most reasonable, the most sophisticated, all these categories that they put together. So it's very important to Americans that when they fight a civil war, that they fight it in a civilized manner. They're very self-conscious and very concerned about appearing to be civilized in front of other civilized nations. And so to be civilized in war was to be restrained, to limit the violence of war as much as possible. It was to fight a war that kind of fit the rules that other civilized nations since the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans had been using. And it was about being honorable. So retaliation, this gets us finally to that. Retaliation is the method when nations are fighting a war with each other. Sometimes atrocities occur. And so retaliation is the method that a civilized nation uses to try to hold their opponent accountable to civilized methods of war. And so it's actually a ritual that was understood and recognized by people on both sides. If the other side does something that you think is not civilized, you write them a letter and you say, you have done this uncivilized act. Here's what it is. You have 15 days to explain what you've done or to prove evidence that it didn't happen. And if you don't do that within a specified period of time, we will retaliate in this named way. The correspondence always names it. And this launches kind of a ritual that both sides understood. And the purpose, even though it often has the opposite effect, but the purpose is actually supposed to de-escalate violence and atrocities.
Right, that's the mutually assured destruction theoretically for people, we won't break the code, and we can speak a little bit about to what extent the code existed or didn't, loose air quotes there. If you violate some sort of, what a civilized warfare would be, then you won't do that because there'll be some sort of threat of retaliation. So it's these kind of, almost invisible building blocks that kind of help things move along to keep the violence in check.
Well, and it's interesting to me because the Confederate Secretary of War, James Seddon, I mean, there were several secretaries of war, but he was there the longest and oversaw many of the retaliation incidents. I mean, he wrote one of his subordinates that the point of retaliation, and I'm kind of quoting him here now, is a thorough reformation of the offending nation. So people need to understand, and this is how the word is misused, retaliation as it was used in the mid-19th century does not mean revenge. It doesn't mean you've done this, so we're going to do that. You're not supposed to do retaliation unless you believe that it can truly change the behavior of the other side.
I see. That's, I think, an important clarification.
Yes.
And again, just to reiterate for folks, if you have any questions as we go along, please don't hesitate to drop them in the comments and we'll get to as many as we can. So I think when a lot of people think about laws and rules of war, which is, kind of what we're dealing with here a little bit, the Geneva Convention comes to mind, but of course, Civil War is fought before, at least before the United States is a part of the Geneva Convention. So that's out. So without that, how did North and South conform to rules? Were there any sort of widely recognized unofficial rules? And, talk about that.
Right. So what had happened is in the 17th and 18th century, there were European philosophers and jurists who wrote lengthy books about kind of laws and rules that were emerging in warfare that civilized nations should follow. So Grotius and Vattel were two of the most recognized and famous writers. Vattel wrote the Law of Nations, and they kind of laid out, here's what war looks like based on the practice of European nations. Here's what you can and kind of cannot do. So these are really long books. They don't always agree with each other. They have some internal contradictions, but Americans were very well aware of them. And so what happens is in the 1840s and 1850s, some US Army officers actually kind of translate these works and distill them into shorter volumes that are kind of reference works for other officers. So Henry Halleck, who ends up being, commander-in-chief of Union armies, and then kind of, the head guy in the War Department after Grant takes over as general-in-chief. Halleck actually, before the war, had written a treatise where he kind of laid out what the laws of war were. So that's kind of where Americans get it. But there's a lot of things that are under debate. So that's one of the contributions that Halleck and then Francis Libre, who many people have heard of, that's the contribution they want to make. So Francis Libre is an immigrant from Germany. He was a professor of politics and international law first at University of South Carolina and then at Columbia. And he and Halleck had actually started a correspondence, and they loved to talk to each other about the laws of war. And Halleck said, we need something that our officers in the US Army can use, because who has time to read these 800-page tomes, so we need something that's just like a handy field guide. So he puts together a committee with Libre kind of as the head of it. that includes Ethan Allen Hitchcock, who's a very well-known, long-standing Army officer. And they put together General Orders Number 100, which they issue in April of 1863. That is kind of Libre's distillation of the laws of war into very short and pithy articles. And so that's kind of after 1863, that technically is how the Union Army is going to view the laws of war, is through General Orders Number 100.
Gotcha. It's sort of an American attempt to make a updated Cliff Notes version of the much longer European treatises on the subject.
Yes, the laws of war for dummies. That's it.
Yeah, well, and it's I'm fairly certain that's pretty widely available. If you type in either General Orders 100 or the Libre Code, you can go find it and read it. And as far as like, long 19th century documents go, it's fairly readable, actually.
Oh yeah, because that was the point. I mean,
exactly.
And Libre was very proud of it because he wrote to Halleck after they were done. No other nation has a document like this where we've made the laws of war readable and succinct. Now, of course, it was also controversial because this is Libre's interpretation of laws of war that can be debated. And what's fascinating to me, is how journalists, people in the general public, I mean, they know that to try to make your case, you have to reference historical precedent and you have to reference some of the great writers. So you see newspapers like the Charleston Mercury, when they're outraged that the Union Army is bombarding the city of Charleston from a distance, and they're trying to show that this is barbaric and horrible behavior. They quote Vattel themselves. Then they say, oh, well, the British did this in 1802, but then the French did this in 1645. So they kind of know you have to make a case. And Libre is trying to cut through that and saying, okay, I've pulled together all these disparate examples and distilled them into principles that we can use.
And good on him for having it stand the test of time to make it fairly readable for you and I, which, like you said, is the point. Jan had an interesting question here in the comments, and I think this is especially interesting. The Civil War is a very democratic war. It's a war fought between two democracies. She asked, was retaliation more a concept that existed in the military command hierarchy, or did it really infiltrate down to the rank and file of the foot soldiers? So were individual soldiers like, hey, they can't do that, that's not right? What level of permeation did that have?
That's a great question, Jan. And it's not even just down to the foot soldiers, it's down to the ordinary public. So let me do the ordinary public before I get to the foot soldiers, because this was one of the things that surprised me the most when I was doing the research. I mean, there are letters to both war departments, the Union and the Confederacy, from ordinary citizens saying, hey, this happened, here's the retaliation that you should do. Like, they actually are writing with suggested retaliation. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that soldiers, this is part of their daily thought or things like that, but soldiers are very aware of retaliation and they talk about it in their letters and diaries when appropriate. So especially if they become aware of something or if they witness something, they will, they'll comment that retaliation is needed. And then this also kind of gets to where kind of official definitions and like a widespread understanding, there can be variation within that, because sometimes you'll see soldiers use the word retaliation when what they actually mean is revenge. So they'll say something like, a Confederate company did this, we should not take prisoners anymore in retaliation. Well, how they're using it isn't actually legal, and it isn't actually what retaliation means to the higher ups, but they know the word is there. They're immersed in that, but they don't necessarily use it in the same way.
Sure. Now, to this point, perhaps some of our faithful viewers might be wondering, now, what does this have to do with medicine? Well, we're about to bring this in here. One of the things that we talk a lot about at the museum is something called the Winchester Accords. I don't know if this is something you came across in your research. So at the First Battle of Winchester, there's a treaty signed between Union and Confederate soldiers that the surgeons will be treated as non-combatants and they won't be taken
Yes.
prisoner. And something that I've always wondered, I mean, we talk about it at the museum as if it were a notable precedent that was set, and that might be so, but sometimes I wonder, was that more of just a local thing that was sort of a one-time deal, or did that really indeed set a precedent? I mean, I'm sure you've spent some time with this, so I'm curious for your thoughts on that, or any other type of kind of
Sure,
early
sure.
efforts to kind of codify this stuff.
Sure. So so that actually, in a sense, doesn't set a precedent. It confirms what was the precedent based on the tell and the articles of war during the American Revolution. So surgeons were not supposed to be treated as combatants. That was something that had been emerging in warfare for some time. And so Henry Halleck would put that in the treaties that he published right before the war. So surgeons are supposed to be released, they can stay and do some humanitarian things to wounded prisoners, but they are not considered combatants who are to be treated as prisoners of war and put in military prisons or treated in the same. So when you bring that up, that's a great point, because there are multiple cases during the Civil War of retaliation regarding both sides not treating surgeons properly. So I didn't end up dealing with them in the book, and I didn't go into a lot of detail, but I found numerous cases across the course of my research about big controversies considering treatment of surgeons. There are times, for various reasons, that Confederate forces will hold on to a surgeon that they've captured, or Union forces will hold on to a surgeon. This inevitably leads to a retaliation correspondence and even to hostage taking. So one of the things that both sides do, if they want if they're in the process of a retaliation ritual and they say, okay, if you do this, we're going to execute some of your prisoners of war as an act of retaliation, then the other side will say, well, then we're going to set aside prisoners of war as hostages. And if you execute our prisoners of war, we'll execute these hostages. And so there are cases that I came across where surgeons are held as hostage for the treatment of other surgeons.
Fascinating. Yeah, well, and I've wondered this before, about the surgeons, whether they're treated as non-combatants, and this sort of leads into another question here, because we have in our collection the journal of one surgeon, Wooden, I believe is his name, Indiana surgeon, who is taken captive at the Battle of Chickamauga and winds up in Libby prison. And I'm reading through this, I'm like, hey, wait a minute, he's not supposed to go there. What's the deal? And so I guess my question is, so, like you said, the Winchester Accords and other things, it confirms precedents that have been set in Europe. And, eventually we get the Libre Code, but, at the end of the day, these are kind of decisions about to take someone prisoner or not, or to do this or to not do this. They're made by individual commanders, most of whom are not career military. So do we have a sense to what degree things like that were followed?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So one issue is the American Civil War is, very decentralized in many ways because of problems in length of time it takes to communicate. I mean, in the Western Theater and the Trans-Mississippi, it takes a long time for orders to get there. People can make local command decisions and do things and then ask for forgiveness later, right? So my answer is kind of twofold. I mean, one, we see local commanders throughout the Civil War in all theaters of war doing things based on their own understanding of what they think the laws of war are that may not match the orders that are being issued by their respective war departments. But at the same time, I'm shocked by how remarkably consistent educated people were in their understanding of what the rules were broadly supposed to be. So even men who weren't career military officers, especially by 1862, 1863, when both sides have made some kind of effort to train people, they knew what the basic rules were supposed to be in terms of treatment of prisoners of war. Now, John, I do have to say, I mean, one of the big reasons that retaliation becomes so important in shaping campaigns is there are some issues that aren't clear in international law. And one of the issues is enslaved people. Is it legal for a nation at war to start an insurrection among enslaved people or serfs? Is it legal to free the slaves of your enemy and then enlist them in your own army? Francis Libre is going to say, of course it is. And here's all the examples from history we have to prove that. The Confederate government is going to say, of course it's not. And here's all the examples that we have from history, including the claims that the United States made in the American Revolution and in the War of 1812, that you can't. So there's going to be times where there is actually disagreement on what the laws of war are. And that's where retaliation is going to make it difficult to resolve those underlying issues.
Right, because they disagree about fundamental issues, and something like retaliation isn't going to, especially in kind of the honor culture, or at least the honor culture aspects of the 19th century, retaliation isn't going to fix the issue because they still think that they're right. The reason why things aren't working smoothly is because there's a fundamental disagreement. So yeah, that makes total sense.
But this is where the honor culture can actually shape campaigns. So both sides agree that surgeons should be treated as non-combatants. One of their big disagreements, of course, is on the issue of Black soldiers. But let me give you an example of how retaliation can actually force the other side to change its policy. And I'll try to do it briefly. So the Union, when it begins enlisting Black soldiers, some of them are formerly enslaved, some of them were born free in the North. When the Confederate Congress issues a retaliation resolution, the Confederate Congress says any Black person, regardless of their previous status, you can't treat them as a combatant. They're not legitimate combatants. And so the Confederate resolution requires any Black person captured in a Union uniform to be turned over to states for trial. The United States is going to draw a line in the sand and say, you can't do that for people who are born free in northern states. Those are northern citizens that, they are legitimate combatants if we choose to enlist them. This causes a huge crisis for the Confederate War Department. And what's really interesting in their correspondence is they're very self-conscious about how Europe is going to view that. Not only, of course, because they're trying to get European recognition, but because Europe is the civilized standard that everyone looks to. Do we get to join that club of civilized nations, right? So and I won't go into all the details. I lay it out in the book. It's a really fascinating story. But basically, the Union gets hold of news of 3 Black New York sailors who are being held in a Charleston jail and not being treated as combatants. And so what the US War Department does is they put 3 white South Carolina soldiers aside as hostages and says, you have to treat free Black soldiers as legitimate combatants. And the Confederacy caves on that issue. And not only so, and we see that, and it unfolds over the course of several months, but at the end of the Battle of Olustee in Florida in February 1864, the Confederacy takes, it's 74, I think, I can't remember the exact number, of Black soldiers that they've captured at Olustee, and they send them to Andersonville. Okay, that's actually recognizing their status as legitimate combatants because they're being sent to a military prison. And then eventually the Confederacy even changes its resolution as an acknowledgement that they have to change the wording. So that's an example of how retaliation can actually change a combatant's behavior.
That's a couple great specific examples there. And we've actually talked on this, this very channel with Dr. Caroline Newhall. And
yes.
She's done a lot of research, of course, about Black prisoners of war. And so it's fun to kind of, or at least interesting to come at it from sort of a different angle from, how that even happened in the first place. And really, really interesting. And it's interesting too, the way you put it, in light of Europe, trying to gain access to this civilized club. It's sort of quote unquote embarrassing for the United States, a civilized nation, to be fighting a civil war but if we're going to be fighting a war, we may as well kind of, look good while we're doing it. And just the way that they're self-consciously kind of thinking about themselves in light of, we want to be part of the club is, I think, a
Yeah.
fascinating wrinkle to this.
Well, and this gets back to Jan's question about soldiers. So what's really fascinating, too, is that a lot of soldiers get very sarcastic about looking to Europe for validation. So there's a wonderful soldier in the 54th Massachusetts who makes a really interesting statement about this that kind of echoes what I saw in some other soldiers. So he's like, why are we always looking to Great Britain for examples of civilized behavior? These are people who tied sepoys to guns during the Indian Mutiny of 1857 and blew them up. That's atrocious and horrible. Why do we care what they think? So, but that again goes back to this is an ordinary soldier who was very well aware of what the British had done in India to suppress the Sepoy Mutiny and was going to use that as an example of barbaric and savage behavior in war by a country that was supposed to be the pinnacle of civilization. So it's interesting to follow soldiers' views of some of these things.
Absolutely, that's quite the connection to make there. Really, really interesting. And we've been talking a lot about how these codes, both official and unofficial, were and weren't recognized by both sides, but specifically with the Libre Code or General Orders 100 that we referred to earlier. It's a union document. And we've talked about how it was respected by the Confederacy, but what sort of communication was there between the War Departments when this comes out? Do they, send a copy, with love to the Confederate War Department, be like, hey, like, do you want to do this? Do you want to follow these? And what was that correspondence like?
Yeah, and so let me make a correction if I gave the wrong impression. The Confederacy, even though they agreed on the ritual of retaliation and they hated General Orders number 100. So what happened was, you're exactly right. The Union War Department, they send a copy to the Confederate War Department and say, here are the rules that we're going to be fighting the war by. So you can imagine that, James Seddon, who was the Secretary of War at this time,
and like what a power play too. Just be
like,
hey, exactly. These are the rules. These are the rules.
Yeah. So he writes this. I mean, he doesn't respond to the U.S. War Department, but he writes like this 10-page, you can just feel the rage kind of dripping on every word that he writes, this 10-page diatribe to his subordinates, not only the presumption of sending this to us, but then everything that he thinks is wrong with General Orders number 100. And I mean, of course, one of it is he zeroes in right away on that. It says, yeah, you can free slaves and you can arm them, and you can, any person of color in the U.S. uniform has to be treated as a combatant. So he's really furious about that. But there's other things too. So there are some strong, Libre tends to take positions that allow, through military necessity, things that you can do to non-combatants that Vattel and some other people would be a little softer on. So Seddon is furious about a lot of that too, because General Orders number 100 allows you to take people's property. It allows you to bombard cities in ways that he does not agree with. And so a lot of the Confederate outrage is about the General Orders number 100's kind of permissiveness in how you can treat the property and persons of people in rebellion.
Sure, and that makes total sense, especially, since the federal government's creating this document, they want it to kind of conform with some of the stuff they're already doing, such as the whole position, like the Second Confiscation Act,
Right.
and the Emancipation Proclamation, for that matter, and the whole argument being made that so that makes a ton of sense. And I'm sure part of it too, when they get this angry letter from James Seddon, the federal government's like, well, you should have made your own laws of war. Was there an attempt by the Confederacy to kind of do something like the Libre Code and send it to Lincoln and Company, or that just didn't happen?
No, they did not do that. Even though they talk continually. I mean, there's just like with the Union, there's a lot of lawyers in the Confederate War Department and in the Confederate Congress. And so, they are very adept at pulling out legal precedent. I mean, when Seddon goes on his tirade in his message to his subordinates, I mean, he's quoting the laws of the Pandex. He's talking about the Romans. He's talking about here's what the Greeks would have done. I mean, because he's trying to show that he just has this wealth of knowledge of legal examples from throughout the history of warfare.
And that makes tons of sense. And maybe had the Confederacy tried to, perhaps it might have been a too many cooks in the kitchen sort of thing. A lot of lawyers getting together. It'd be tough to come up with something. But anyway, interesting question from Daniel over here in the comments. So this is getting at sort of a specific example, another one of what this might have looked like. You brought up, sort of prisoners of war, but this is sort of a slightly different situation. He says, at Port Hudson, a Union officer in an apparent panic raised a white flag. When the Confederates stopped firing, Union soldiers used the pause to escape. The Confederates complained to Union leadership. How common were episodes like this, and was there much communication between the sides, and was there retaliation for things like this? So you had talked about retaliation previously, as it relates to prisoners of war, but this is like, more how war is conducted. Like, I guess how petty of an offense merits a complaint, I guess, is part of this.
Well, so actually, and I know that you weren't trying to say this, but the example that Dan gave us is not petty. If you raise a white flag and you act like you're surrendering, and then the other side stops shooting, and then you use that to escape, that's actually a serious problem, because that's going to lead to eventually people not respecting white flags, and not giving people the ability to surrender is key in making a war civilized. A war where neither side can surrender is a war of the black flag, and that you've degenerated to where passions are just running loose. So yes, there are many retaliation incidents about misuse of a white flag, and there's a lot of, so that's one of the other fascinating things. Opposing brigadier generals, opposing major generals, they write to each other constantly during campaigns. And the correspondence is fast, and they will bring up things like that. I mean, they will say, you raised a white flag, the men ran off, what are you going to do about this? And they usually request, send me a letter that shows that you've taken disciplinary action. And if you do that, then I won't retaliate. But if you, don't do that, then I will retaliate in some way. And then to get to your point about petty, I mean, what's hilarious is I saw retaliation correspondence about misuse of the flag where they give each other correspondence. In other words, there was a great correspondence between General George Thomas and John Bell Hood. And it was in the aftermath of the Nashville battle. And, they were setting up some kind of flag to exchange wounded prisoners or something like that. And Thomas's staff doesn't go to the right place where they agreed that the exchange would take place. And I mean, there is a big deal, because you can use a flag of truce to try to spy on where your enemy's pickets and your enemy's outposts are, right? So, I mean, it's not totally petty. But this particular correspondence, I mean, it just got down into the minutia of, where the horses were, and if you don't show up at the right place, and they will do correspondence about every little violation of etiquette. They will.
That's so interesting. I guess it's just not something I think about very often, like inter-army communication, which, yes, as you say, was quite common. And there's probably an interesting book to be written, because I'm sure that this sort of thing, retaliation and etiquette, breaches of laws of war and things like that, are not the only things they talk about. Or maybe it is, but there's perhaps an interesting book written, or article to be written about inter-army communication throughout the Civil War.
Yes.
Let me see here. Now, what are some key areas where laws of war, both official and unofficial, broke down that maybe we haven't covered? I'm thinking perhaps the far west, where this is maybe a bit of a caricature, but probably the closer you get to the Mississippi River and beyond, probably the less regulated things tend to get. The further out west, a lot of guerrilla type action and things of that
Mhm.
nature. Or maybe it's something else entirely. But is there any area that we maybe haven't covered yet that we want to make sure we get to?
So I want to cover two things. One is I want to just briefly touch on that guerrilla issue. So I don't find that things are necessarily, I would say, less regulated. Officers who are posted in the West or the Trans-Mississippi, especially if they're former regular Army officers, I mean, Grant, Sherman, Van Dorn, any of these guys, I mean, they care deeply about following the customs of civilized war. And they generate as big a correspondence about it as we see. But the issue is the Western theater and the Trans-Mississippi very early has a lot of issues about irregular war. And that dynamic is very different, because what makes that different is Union commanders do not believe that people who do not wear, so they believe you are not a legitimate combatant if you don't wear a uniform, if you go back to your house after you do something, and if you fight from ambush. And they think that that's completely consistent with the international customs of war. And they're actually right about that. So they never recognize Confederate guerrillas. Partisans are a different thing. If they wear uniforms, if they report to a Confederate command structure, even if they fight from ambush, they're still legitimate combatants because they're under the authority of a state-based army. But if they're just people who turn out, fire on Union soldiers, go back to their homes, never wear uniforms, Union commanders say these aren't legitimate combatants. And under the laws of war and under General Orders Number 100, you can summarily execute pirates and banditti. So Union officers in the West and Mississippi, they call guerrillas banditti or wild beasts. Sherman calls guerrillas wild beasts. And they are adamant, and they will not change their mind, that they have the right to summarily execute guerrillas. And they do. And what makes this dynamic so different is the Confederacy backs down from every retaliation about that. Because on the bottom line, Confederate officers agree that that kind of guerrilla warfare, while they say, well, the people have a right to rise up when their land is invaded, but deep down, they actually know that the laws of war do not legitimize the way that Confederate guerrillas in Missouri and along the Mississippi River are fighting. And so they back down from every retaliation correspondence about it. It's very interesting. So the second one that I want to bring up is one where the Confederacy has the laws of war on their side, and Union officers are really uncomfortable with their own soldiers, and that's in the area of pillaging. So there's a clear distinction in the laws of war between foraging and pillaging. Foraging is allowed by the laws of war. It's when a commander says, okay, we need to live off the land for this military operation, but we're going to send out disciplined parties who forage, and they don't enter they don't enter people's houses, they don't touch private property. Well, there's several incidents where Union commanders themselves start to worry that their soldiers are kind of out of control of this regulated system. And one of them is obviously Sherman's March through Georgia and South Carolina. And we see a lot of Union soldiers engage in pillaging, even though technically under their orders, they're not supposed to. And so this leads to one of the biggest kind of back and forth executions that we have in the Civil War, because what starts happening is that Confederate soldiers and citizens start executing Union soldiers who are away from their commands and who are pillaging. And so Sherman ends up executing 43 Confederate prisoners of war in South Carolina in a retaliation incident. But at the same time that he does that, because what Sherman says is, if anyone executes my foragers, I want to take life for life. And he tells this to Confederate officers who are opposing him. But he also says to Confederate officers, and he also publicly puts it in orders to his own soldiers, that if Confederates kill any of his soldiers who are pillaging or firing a house, he doesn't deem it wrong, and he won't intervene, and he doesn't care. because he recognizes that Union soldiers who pillage are violating the laws of war, and that under the Articles of War, you can shoot down a soldier who's engaged in the act of pillaging.
That's so interesting. And it gets to, especially since this was as big of a storyline with the march through Georgia and South Carolina as you say it was, it further complicates what I think is a fascinating study in historic memory, the way that Sherman's march through Georgia and South Carolina is remembered, in that, even Sherman was like, yeah, we're not trying to like burn people's houses, even though that's oftentimes how it was portrayed. Now, all kinds of things were burned and destroyed and such, but the way that Sherman approached it and such, and the retaliations, it's a fascinating story, further complicated by exactly what you just laid out.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of people also don't realize that a lot of the burning of houses, and I'm not trying to say this was every incident, but a lot of the burning of houses that Union armies do, and even during Sherman's March, is actually a retaliation. So if Confederate citizens tore down a bridge or put mines in the public road or fired from behind trees on the army, and it's not the action of the Confederate Army, it is a typical retaliation response, even dating back in Europe, 2 centuries past. The way you retaliate for citizens who are resisting an army is that you burn their houses.
That's I love that. Well, it's a
I know
cool.
what you mean.
Yeah. And that's why I think this book is so brilliant, Rites of Retaliation, because it provides this context, to things that I think most folks, who study Civil War history are, know some things about, the retaliations, and, the fact that there were kind of some laws, they know some things about it, but it's you put it in context, this long context that the people at the time were very aware of and building from. So it situates the Civil War just so in the wider context of sort of the Western world, which is so clever in this regard.
Thank you. Well, and that's one thing I want to throw this into if we're talking about the context of its time. I also tried to situate it in the angst that Americans felt. So both sides worried that the war was showing that they weren't as civilized as they thought they were. And one of the things that I try to do is I show the officers and the civilian officials who are traumatized by their own side, like not by the enemy's behavior, but by, so, I use an officer who comes to be part of Sherman's chief of staff, like right before they leave for the march to the sea. And this is a guy who's a lawyer. He cares a lot about civilization, and he spends the whole march interviewing brigade commanders, interviewing regimental commanders. Did your men misbehave? Did we do anything uncivilized? Because he's so concerned that letting soldiers loose on a countryside is going to bring out their savage passions, and that they're not going to be restrained. And if they're not, that reflects on his society, right? And so I try to show Americans kind of experienced a crisis of civilization. Does this war show us that we're not who we thought we were?
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially because in the Civil War, there have been soldiers roaming around the countryside before in American history, but there have been kind of clear good guys and bad guys, as it were. Like, okay, we got the Americans, we don't have to worry about what they're going to do while they're here. Whereas with the Civil War, obviously people are on one side or the other, of course, but it's the behavior that Americans do, say Northern soldiers in the South or vice versa. It all still kind of reflects on the United States, even though, again, they're different sides. Yeah, that's such an interesting dynamic that you just highlighted there. Couple questions over here from the comments. One from Robert. He asked, perhaps I missed it, but were there any civilian women ever executed as a result of retaliation?
That's a really good question. So I can't say categorically yes or no, because the records of that are so vast. I can't claim that I have seen everything. But my answer to that is no, because even though this is interesting, General Orders number 100 does say that women can be she rebels and she traitors and are subject to the hard hand of war. But killing a woman, a white woman, let me clarify, would be such a shocking and uncivilized act that off the top of my head, I can't think of any examples of that. The federal government executes Mary Surratt for her part in the assassination conspiracy. So that's a public, if that's not a retaliation, but that's a public execution of a woman. The first, execution by the federal government. And it was that just goes to show it was so shocking. But I can't think of a retaliation incident where a woman is executed.
And then, let's see here, Gary asked, was there any retaliation due to poor or no medical care of prisoners? I mean, of course, Henry Wirtz is famously tried afterwards, but
that's a great question. And the answer is yes. And I deal with that in the book. And it's a retaliation that is actually done illegally and poorly and not along the lines of how the ritual is supposed to work. So what happens is Major General John G. Foster, when he takes command of the U.S. Department of the South in 1864, he is the commander that's immediately on the ground when the first news starts reaching Union lines about the conditions in Andersonville. And then when Union prisoners of war are transferred from Andersonville and Macon, Georgia into South Carolina, a lot of prisoners escape and they make their way to Foster's headquarters on Hilton Head, South Carolina, and he starts getting a word about the rations about the medical condition of Union prisoners. So he decides, he gets authority from the War Department to do a retaliation that involves the fact that Union prisoners have been brought to Charleston and put under fire. So he's able to bring some Confederate prisoners of war to Charleston Harbor and put them under fire from Confederate guns. So this is ostensibly about this, prisoners of war being under fire, but he decides to add to that and make a retaliation for the physical health and the medical condition of Union prisoners of war. And so what he does is he sends a message to his counterpart that basically says, I'm going to retaliate for the treatment of Union prisoners of war. And he sets aside these 600 Confederate officers and he sends them to Fort Pulaski in Georgia and to the Provost Jail on Hilton Head. And he has them given the exact rations and the exact medical treatment that he believes that Union prisoners are receiving based on the reports that he has from escaped prisoners. So these guys get really sick and everyone acknowledges that they're getting sick because of the rations and the treatment that they're given. And the reason that I say that this is a problematic retaliation is because Foster doesn't do the ritual correctly. He should have sent in the letter, here are the conditions of the prisoners of war from Andersonville. You have 15 days to explain this, to tell me my facts are wrong. He's got to give the other side time to respond. And then he has to let them know, I have set aside these 600 officers and I'm going to give them the exact treatment and he doesn't do that. He sends this very vague and general letter. So the point is, there's no way that retaliation can change the behavior of the Confederate prison system because they don't know what's going on. So it's an illegal retaliation. And all it does is make a bunch of Confederate officers really sick.
Yeah, I'm sure the person that got the letter was like, whoa, wasn't quite ready for that type of escalation there. Well, as we're coming to the end of our time here, I wondered if maybe, I always like to ask authors this because of what just a gargantuan achievement putting a book out into the world is. I mean, it's just incredible amount of work that goes into it. If someone picks up a copy of Rites of Retaliation, what's your hope for the book? What do you hope they take away?
I hope they take away an understanding of what Americans thought civilization and civilized war was. I actually hope that they understand the word civilization more than they did before, because 19th century Americans use the word civilization constantly. And most historians just quote them without kind of unpacking what was civilization. And so I hope they come away with my book a better understanding of what people meant by that.
Yeah, that's great. Trying to help us inhabit the mind
Yes, that's
of the
exactly
19th
right.
century. And you hit upon a great point that certain words that are used on a very regular basis, both then and now,
Mhm.
the texture of those words has changed in some cases over
Yes,
time. And I think you're very right to point to civilization as a very key one of those words.
yes.
So closing with just a few things from the comments here. Quay says, watching from Vancouver Airport during a layover. Grew up in Hanover, Pennsylvania, near Gettysburg. Glad you could catch us between planes. I was just flying myself last week, so glad to hear that. And then, what better way to close than this? Suzanne says, "This is a great program. We'll definitely get this book. Thanks so much."
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
Yes, so this has been great. I answered a lot of my questions, and I know I had a great time. Hopefully, everyone out there watching enjoyed it as much as I did. If you like the program, please share it, hit the like button, tell your friends about it, send it to folks. It's a great, easy, free way to support the museum. And if you want to take your support one step further, consider donating to the Barton Letter Fund. We just recently acquired some letters written by Clara Barton, which talk about the Missing Soldiers Office, which is one of our 3 museum locations. So it's a really exciting opportunity that we have, and you can sponsor a paragraph in one of the 2 letters that we have. So you'll find links for that in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back next week talking with Dr. Brian Jordan about his work on Union veterans after the Civil War. So that should be a great program.
That will be fantastic. He is great.
Absolutely. So get excited for that. We'll be back with that. I believe it is next Wednesday for that program. Same time, same place. And until then, this is John and Lorien signing off. Thank you so much for being with us, Lorien.
Thank you, John. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate it.
All right. We'll catch everyone
Bye.
next time.